Welcome to NovoEDTalks, a podcast for authentic, honest conversations about talent development and the people shaping it. On this show, we sit down with leaders across learning and development, mentorship, leadership development, HR, and people strategy to talk about what's really working, what's changing, and what they're learning along the way. These aren't surface-level interviews. They're candid conversations about building skills, developing leaders, supporting managers, and creating experiences that actually move organizations forward. Before we jump in, a quick word about NovoED. Founded at Stanford's Social Algorithms Lab in 2012, NovoED is a people-centric talent development platform built for enterprises and training providers. Business transformation starts with people, and people perform better on NovoED. In today's fast-changing landscape, upskilling requires a new approach. NovoED makes it easy to move beyond the talent development status quo by combing social, collaborative, cohort-based learning with real-world application. The result is future-ready talent built on a platform designed to turn learning into measurable impact. Now, let's meet our guests for today's NovoEDTalks episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NovoEDTalks podcast, a space for talent development trailblazers to get real. My name is Melissa Fisk. I'm the producer of the NovoEDTalks podcast, and today I am joined by Audrey Witters, an education and innovation leader with more than 2 decades of experience shaping the future of online and executive education. As the inaugural managing director of online executive programs at Stanford Graduate School of Business, Audrey led the creation of Stanford LEAD, a groundbreaking online business program that has reached thousands of professionals around the world. Today, through her work at Learning Impact Advisors, she partners with leading institutions to design scalable, financial, sustainable learning experiences that bridge the gap between academic research and real-world professional impact. Audrey, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here on the NovoEDTalks podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, why don't you start by just kind of introducing yourself a little bit more and sharing a bit about your journey, from leading online programs at Stanford to advising organizations on learning strategy.
I actually might go back a little bit further. I started with the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, managing operations for the on-campus executive education programs. And this gave me a really deep appreciation for how the faculty and staff carefully orchestrated the entire program experience beyond just the content to make sure that the learning events were memorable and impactful for all of our participants. And so when I was asked to launch the online program business, they gave me a goal to not only develop programs that could scale, right, but programs that honored what made that on-campus program experience so valuable, right? We had not only to be scalable, we had to have learning experiences which were rigorous, which were high touch, which were experiential, and which were social. And there were a lot of people, including several of our faculty, who were pretty skeptical if that would even be possible. But we created the LEAD program and we demonstrated that online programs did not have to be superficial and did not have to be isolating. And the approach that I took there really, drives how I advise organizations developing learning products today, which is you have to start with your learning goals. You have to start with the behaviors that you want people to learn and that you want people to master and understand why you want those things. And then you need to be intentional and creative about how you can best architect that full experience to achieve those goals in whatever, modality and format you're using.
Absolutely. I love what you said there, right? Where it's like the balance of intentional and creative, right? And I think that's so important, like having a good, healthy balance of both. Audrey, for adult learners in the workplace right now, what pressures or challenges are kind of shaping their reality that you're seeing?
As long as I've been involved in executive and professional education, it's been true that learners always feel too stretched and too busy and pulled in too many directions at once. And often when you just add a training to their calendar, it lands for them as another, to-do item, like something to get through and check off as quickly as possible. And, that's a terrible mindset for curiosity and learning. But I think there's also something that's been true for a really long time, and it seems to still be true, but continuing to accelerate, which is the pace of change in the workplace, right? There is like a near constant need for working professionals to become proficient with new technologies and new ways of working. And this is, obviously exacerbated by the disruption across industries that we're seeing with generative AI. Um, Learners need to understand not only how do I use these new tools to do my job better and more effectively, but at the same time, how do I learn these tools and grow my skills so that I can stay, relevant as AI transforms and replaces jobs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's so true and definitely something that, has people even maybe a little scared right now, So I think that's a whole new thing too, right? Where maybe there hasn't been fear like that before. So I think that's very relevant. Audrey, if you picture the ideal state of learning or talent development inside an organization, what does that actually look like in practice? Not just what's offered, but how people learn, apply, and grow.
Yeah, I think that it's especially about how people learn, apply, and grow, and less about what's actually offered. I think the ideal state is when organizations encourage employees to find specific career paths or new skills, stretch assignments and roles that they're interested in, intrinsically curious about, intrinsically motivated for, to learn how to do something new. And then when they provide the employees with the resources that they need, including the training, right, to be successful in those roles and assignments. It's gotta start with that motivational framing. And I feel like when you do that, professional learning can be received as the ultimate employee perk, right? And it's not an antidote to employee burnout, right? So I think for me, and I've seen this with people who work for me and around me, right? We get burned out not because we're working too many hours, but because we're working too many, you know, frustrating or boring hours.
That resonates so well. Like, I think that's such a good point to burnout that, like, doesn't get talked about enough. So, sorry for interrupting, but I just absolutely agree with that and think that's a bigger conversation we should be having. So, please go back to to talking what you're talking about there, but no, I love that.
Yeah, I feel like you can work 8 hours in a day and hate all those hours and those hours needing to go get a beer or take a nap or something. If you're not loving what you're doing. But I think learning and curiosity unlocks a drive where you can work if you're learning, if you're following your curiosity, if you're practicing something that you've just picked up and mastering it, right? I think it's easy to go 10, 12, more hours in a day and feel not burned out, feel energized, right? Love it, be excited about it. And I think that's because we as human beings, when we're in the right mindset, we really love and are our best selves, right, when we're learning. So this is why I feel like it's sort of the ultimate perk, right? Because not only is it something that employees are enjoying, but the company is benefiting as well.
Absolutely. I think that's so insightful and so many companies could just like sit with that for a minute, right? And really think about what that means. So I love that you shared that. Where do you see the biggest gap between this kind of ideal state and how most organizations are operating today?
I think the gap, like I said, I think the gap is that organizations, but employees too, right, are treating this talent development and professional learning as something that's transactional, right? Rather than something that's cultural and that they're motivated by. They're looking at it as, compliance and certification instead of exploration and practice. Um, I think I would add to that another big gap is that in organizations, learning tends to be done individually, and I don't think that's how we learn best. I think that we learn best, in community. Nobody goes to preschool or high school or college by themselves, right? I think we learn best when we're supporting each other and sharing our challenges and sharing our insights with each other.
Absolutely, because I don't think any like two people look at a problem necessarily the same way always. And so they come up with like different aspects of a solution, right? That we can really share with one another and take that a long way. I'm teaching my daughter math right now for in a pre-K kindergarten level. So I see how I'm trying to understand how her brain works, right? And it's such an easy thing that I know, right? But it's like, wait, how is she thinking about this? But obviously, like, that's a way to simplify what you're saying there. But yeah, I think that that's a good point about, working collaboratively and working as a group because it can be that much more powerful. Audrey, a lot of organizations still measure success by completion or participation. Where does that fall short? And what does transformational learning really look like instead?
You think about if you're measuring your salespeople, and you could measure them based on how many phone calls they make in a day. And that's probably going to correlate somewhat with, how much revenue they're bringing in for the organization. But at the same time, I could make calls all day and be the person leading the, call chart and not bring in a single dollar. And companies invest so much of their time and money and their employees' time in development. I think it's I think it's crazy that they stop short of connecting, the results to the actual KPIs and the actual metrics and the actual business results that they care about and that they're trying to improve. Um, Completion rates and participation rates and satisfaction scores that like don't tie that way are kind of meaningless. I think there's no reason to not figure out how to directly measure impact, right? If you define upfront what you're trying to achieve with a program, then you figure out how to measure whether you've achieved it. And I think that not only is going to help organizations know if their training programs are being effective in the way they want them to be, I think it also is going to positively affect the motivation of the learners, right? Because I know that the company cares about my learning. They care that I'm going to acquire these skills, right? And they trust that this won't be a waste of my time. So I can trust that this won't be a waste of my time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. On the flip side of that, what signals, tell you that learning is actually changing behavior and it's not just being consumed? We're not just looking at these standalone completion rates.
I think usually you can measure directly the success of whether you're improving the metrics you want to improve with a training program. I do think you need to break down, what is the competencies required to achieve a KPI. So again, if we're talking about sales, maybe I need to have a competency of identifying the target customer properly, communicating the value proposition, negotiating, closing the sale, right? These different competencies. You want to break down and identify those. And then I think you want to think about measuring three different things. So you want to measure a baseline of where is the team now with these competencies. And then you design the training to close the gaps. And then when the training is done, you can assess directly when the training is done skill behavior or behavior change yet, right? So you can assess confidence. I feel confident that I can identify the right customer, close the sale, whatever. But the most important thing is to have an assessment like several months later, 6 months later, a year later, depending. And this is what a lot of companies like don't even bother to do, but it's probably the most important measurement because that's the only way you're going to know if you actually delivered behavior change that stuck and that was maintained over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. I do love the confidence piece too. Like that's such a huge, I know it's not necessarily an easy thing to measure, but I think like, seeing that is, a very good indicator of how learning has changed behavior or not.
I think it's even just the way you phrase a question is important. Do I know the value proposition of our product versus do I feel confident that I can communicate the value proposition of our product? When you're doing a baseline measurement, you want to look at the latter because you're trying to affect skill development and behavior, not, knowledge acquisition and retention.
You talk, about closing the gap between, ideas and actions. Why is that gap so persistent? And what have you seen work when it comes to embedding learning into real work?
I think that gap is because we're teaching, knowledge and expecting that to translate to behavior change, right? We're presenting information, but we're not offering enough structured opportunities to actually do anything with that information. I think we have to start thinking about learning experiences that focus on skill building. And I think that means a couple of things. I think, you start with the mindset and the motivation. We're presenting this training and development in a way that is inspiring curiosity. Um, and then I think you have to design learning that includes these opportunities for applied practice and feedback and iteration. And then we have to look at the end of the program you know, as a transition into a new phase of learning rather than, the end of a singular event.
Absolutely. And you mentioned like applied practice and iteration. Like, what role do those things and maybe some other qualities, play in helping learning actually stick over time? And like, what other things should we be considering?
Yeah, I mean, I think experimentation and iteration are critical to any sort of behavior change, right? Moving from a conceptual framework to a mastered usable skill requires continuous and iterative practice. Like you can't ask somebody to memorize information or understand a concept and then expect their behavior to change. Um, you have to practice in, progressively less safe and less controlled environments, and that practice has to be coupled with reflection, with feedback, both backwards and forwards, right? Like, so how did that go? What was hard? What went well? And then forward, like, what should I think about next time? What might I adjust in my approach to see different results? And then you have to iterate and you have to repeat that over time in different contexts and keep reflecting and keep adjusting. We know that this is true with other skills we try to acquire, right? We know this is true if I want to learn a sport. We know this is true if I'm trying to play a musical instrument, but somehow we don't think about it, right? We don't think about it when we're talking about behavioral skills that we use at work.
That's literally exactly what I was thinking, like, as you were explaining this. I'm like, this is literally like you're teaching sports or a musical instrument or math, to my daughter, writing, spelling. Like, these are things that we're like, you have to practice it over and over again. And somewhere along the way, like, we forget that, or we think it like doesn't matter anymore, which it is so true. Like the basics of practicing. Yeah. So I love that. Audrey, there's often a tension between scaling programs and maintaining depth. How do you design learning experiences that scale without losing what makes them impactful?
I think most of the time that tension is maybe imagined, or maybe the challenges that produce that tension, like, they're not exactly where we think they are. Um, a lot of people will think that, right, scaled programs, online programs are forced to be sort of superficial because they can't deliver nuanced and personalized feedback, right? So I'm gonna review material, and then I'm gonna have a multiple choice quiz because that's all that the computer can grade. That's the only way I can automate feedback. I can't have an essay or a project because I don't have time to have somebody go look at that project and give feedback or read that essay, right? And provide feedback for it. But the truth is that you could, if you're just trying to affect learning, a guided self-reflection can achieve the same, not the same, but very close to the same results as that personalized feedback, right? And honestly, now you can give an AI agent a rubric and they can probably deliver better personalized feedback than a human being could. But the feedback wasn't really what the problem was, right? The problem was that um, if we didn't grade the essay the way we graded the multiple choice quiz, people didn't do it or they didn't do a good job of it. And that's really a problem of motivation. That's not a problem of automation. So I think we have to get at what the motivational problems here are, right? I think the first thing is you have to have the learner has to come with, like I said before, the learner has to come with a curiosity mindset, not a transaction mindset. They have to want to build the skill. If you want to build the skill, you're going to do the practice because you're not just trying to put a check in a box. Um, I think also, though, one of the challenges that online programs have is is a little more subtle, but I think learners don't feel cared about. Um, I think as human beings, we we need to feel to learn our best, right? To really feel motivated to learn over time when we hit struggle, we have to feel like another person is invested in our learning. Um, and I think even if you have AIs that are giving you really great personalized feedback, they're not going to provide that feeling of somebody genuinely cares that I developed this skill. So I think there are a couple of ways with online learning to close that gap. Um, I think this is one of the reasons it's really important to have well-designed online programs, right? It should look like someone cared about this program and put it together in a way that I'm going to feel like I want to show up and have a commensurate effort to my learning. And I also think it's why it pays off to create an organizational culture that emphasizes learning and values learning, and that ideally provides a community for that learning.
You mentioned 2 things that are, again, kind of balancing each other out, like, you in order to create, like, this really rich learning environment, like, your learners have to be intrinsically motivated to want to learn, but at the same time, you have to have about the other piece of that, which is someone who actually cares about them learning and what they're learning, and I think that's, like, a really beautiful concept that, if we could keep both sides in mind when we're designing learning programs, that would take us a long way. You keep mentioning community. We talked a little bit about like learning socially and how folks do better in those types of environments. And I think it's pretty obvious that community and like social learning drive engagement. But what does that actually look like, or what does it actually take to build that type of community in a program?
Obviously, I think that learning is a social act, and that it's very hard to learn in a silo, and a lot easier to learn when we feel a sense of mutual accountability with other people. Um, but that's not always easy to do in an online program, in a scalable program. And I think there are degrees of what you can offer. I think you can start with just a feeling of social presence. So by that I mean if the learning platform is providing any sort of cues that let me know other people are learning alongside me, um, even simple things like, polls or examples of comments from previous learners, right? That's going to help learners feel less isolated, even if they're not having any direct interaction with other learners. Um, and you can go beyond that and build ecosystems of people. You can utilize mentors or peer-to-peer contact or alumni contact. Having people come back and teach new learners what they've already learned is really powerful, and something that people actually like doing. Like, they don't need a lot of nudging um, to share I mean, look at TripAdvisor or Wikipedia or Reddit, right? People love to share their expertise with others and teach others, right? So, um, I would also say, though, like you mentioned community, I mentioned community too, and to get to what, like, maybe a capital C community, I think that's harder than people often expect it to be. You have to be intentional and invest in that. Now, I think it pays off, right? But you can't make a community by putting on a message board or telling learners to give each other feedback. The community has to be, I think, deeper than that, right? People have to be inspired to wanna help each other, right? And to cause that to be true, you have to create a space that feels psychologically safe, right? And you have to find a way to give people a sense of shared identity. Um, a and those take a little bit of effort on the part of That they don't just come for free by putting a feature into a program. I think in most contexts, it's worth the investment because the learning pays off not only during, with the impact directly during the learning experience, but also it's going to grow and compound over time. Um, but it can't be a cursory effort.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's so true. And that's, it has to be authentic, like, in order for it to really, like, grow and scale and be powerful, I think. And it's like, I think that's such a challenge for organizations because it's like, I want to create this thing, but it's almost like the organization creating it itself, like, takes away the authenticity a little bit if you don't do it right, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. You have to co-create the community with the learners. You can't just give it to them. They have to have they have to see themselves in it, right? And be given their own shared personality as a community. The cohorts going through it each they should feel a little bit different from each other.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And this might be your answer. The community answer might be your answer to my next question. But, many, standard learning programs have an end. What should organizations be doing differently to kind of reinforce learning after the program is over? I think, obviously community could be a solution for that. But what else would you answer to that question?
Yes, absolutely, community can be, but it should not be the only solution to that, doesn't need to be the only solution to that. This is this is actually most organizations think about a program that, starts and they spend a lot of time planning the program and then everybody comes, they deliver the program and then it's over and they do not think about it again, except for like, okay, now what's the next one? Um, but when you realize that if you don't reinforce that content and that learning a week later, up to 90% of what people learned could be forgotten as they get back into their routines of work, right? If you're not offering some kind of structured reinforcement, and continual learning after that program ends. So, there's all kinds of ways organizations can address this. They can have a learning community, and I think that's an absolutely powerful way um, t to engage, the motivation of learning to motivate the continuation of learning over time. Um, I think connecting, like I was saying, connecting past learners with new learners and letting them reinforce the learning by teaching others. Like you were saying, you're probably remembering some stuff about math or renewing your thinking about math as you're teaching your daughter. Um, so I think that's a great way to do it. But I mean, even like if I'm surveying people 3 months out, 6 months out, 9 months out, maybe I'm going to couple that with a little bit of refresher content. um, Maybe I'm going to say, "Oh, look, people are remembering this and feeling confident about this and implementing this, but over here they're struggling. Let me use that as an opportunity to go back and reinforce those concepts or maybe teach them in a new way." You can offload this to the managers of the learners, right? So here is a toolkit for how to support your employee now that they've acquired these skills to make sure that they're not lost over time. And there's so many ways to do this, but I think the thing is that organizations just need to decide to do it. 95% of training budgets are spent on the learning event, and there's almost nothing left over to think about what happens next. And what happens next is actually what matters.
No, absolutely. I love that. And that's something, like, from a marketing perspective, we're always thinking about what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And I think that's, like, actually a good concept that could be taken to, other parts of the organization as well, like learning, especially where it's like, okay, what's the next thing after this? Like, what's the next thing? How do we want them to use this? Like, really with, almost anything. It's like, what is the next thing what comes next? Not that I'm saying don't live in the present or in the what
No,
you're
but it's a
doing, but I think
journey,
that,
right? You have a marketing journey, you have a customer journey, you need to have a learning journey.
yeah, no, I love that. I love that the word journey is, like, very powerful here. I think that's very clear. Thinking about, as you reflect, on kind of the industry where we're at right now, what do you think L&D leaders need to unlearn? And what do they need to double down on to keep up with how everything is evolving right now?
So unlearn, I think L&D leaders need to unlearn two things, right? One, the idea that talent development is knowledge acquisition, right? It's not. It's skill building, and that's a different kind of learning. And number two, what we were just talking about, right? That unlearn the idea that that learning is a transactional event with a well-defined, beginning and end. Um, and then what should they double down on? I think providing opportunities to iteratively practice behaviors. And this is, especially now that it's so easy relatively easy to produce, simulations and personalized feedback with Gen AI. Um, and then and then especially double down on building cultures and communities within the organization that support continual learning.
I love that. I love that. I think that's great. Great advice. Just like very practical, very straightforward, very relevant with where we're at right now. Audrey, I have one last question for you, which is my favorite question to ask. But, if you're thinking about your career and your journey, what is one lesson that you wished you had learned earlier in your career journey that you would have passed on to your younger self or that you would pass on to someone who's just starting out on theirs?
I think I would say that the thing that is enduring throughout your career is the relationships that you build, right? The people that you are able to connect with. Um, Building a network of people that you respect and trust and paying forward into that network, I think is the most important thing that you can do. I have a son who has just graduated literally last week from college, and I hope that that's, it's so easy to focus on titles and money and what's the best thing I can do right now, but surrounding yourself with people and building relationships with people is what's really going to sustain you holistically through your career and your transitions throughout your life.
Absolutely. I love that. And that's such a good piece of advice just for life in general, right? Like it's just a very, we're all here for such a short time in the grand scheme of things. And like, why not we're not meant to be alone, like have people with you that can go through this with you. So I think that's a really beautiful way to end this episode. Audrey, thank you so much for joining us on the NovoEDTalks podcast today. We greatly appreciate you being here.
Oh my goodness, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of NovoEDTalks.